Are you ready to perform at your highest potential? Welcome to the Performance Matters podcast from GP Strategies, your talent transformation partner. In each episode, we'll interview industry experts and explore best practices and innovative insights to help your organization improve performance. Hello and welcome to the Performance Matters podcast. I'm your host, Michael Teal. Today, we are addressing the question of what happens when personal values collide with one's professional responsibilities. What do we do and how do we align the two? To tackle this weighty topic, I'm pleased to be joined by Jeremy Lewis, a senior inclusion trainer with GP Strategies. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Very much looking forward to our chat.
I love it. Now, I am in Phoenix, Arizona. Where's home for you?
So I'm based over just northeast of Manchester in a place called Saddleworth in the foothills of the Pennines. So I have a very beautiful view out of my window on sunny days, but I have to say it rains here quite a lot.
Well, I know here in Arizona, we would definitely take some of that rain. So I will put that on my to-do list to check out the beautiful area where you're at. Like I said, we're glad to have you. This is a very, very timely topic. Before we get too far into this, though, Jeremy, I'd love it if you just share a little bit about your professional background.
I was just going to mention the fact that I used to be a professional musician and music educator for about 20 years. And then 22 years ago, I moved over to the world of organizational development, bringing sort of a whole bunch of educational psychology with me. And then I've spent the last 22 years working in many, many different organizations, looking at things like organizational development, strategic development, coaching many leaders, working with senior leadership teams, and looking at management development and leadership development. And I guess probably about 15 years ago, we moved more and more into the world of inclusion. And I've spent much of that time working in, I think, probably every sector, from oil rigs to ultra high net worth investment, right through to hospitals and manufacturing or distribution organizations, and you name it, pretty much I've worked with those over the last 20 years. Really just looking at how fundamentally people include others in the workplace, how we get along, how we work together, and how frankly sometimes we don't, and just getting people and leaders to realize in order to create this culture where we can get the best out of people and get people to get along, we've got to work hard at it. And actually, as human beings, we're not that great at including people that are a bit different from what we're used to including. We lose out on talent as a result. So it's really just getting people to be aware of that and what they can do about it. And I guess when values collide, the topic we're talking about today is pretty much a part of that.
Yeah, and I'm going to say something that probably won't surprise you too much, Jeremy, but, looking at the current political and economic climates, the way they're influencing business and workplace relationships, it seems a little different than what we're used to. I mean, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I think people are much more inclined now to share their thoughts and engage in conversation about non-work related things. So from your perspective, someone who's actively in this area, how are you seeing this come to life?
I think there's a couple of things that are happening. So I think, first of all, we started to get more questions and requests for programs like respect and integrity, conflict. How do we have difficult conversations? How do we deal with behavior? And when we were talking to clients and finding out why they were asking this, there seemed to be more and more disputes within the workplace, collisions between people. And some of those seem to sit much more with people's fundamental values. They seem to be at the root of these conversations. And they were often about things that, as you hinted at just now, we didn't used to talk about in the workplace. There were those verboten things like religion, politics, sexual identity, and things like that. Whereas now leaders and managers are sort of finding this stuff's coming up. As you said about the political divisions that we're seeing, this is coming up more and more. And not through any fault of their own, leaders and managers are finding they don't really have the skills to deal with it, or it's a bit more frightening or intimidating to deal with it. How do I deal with conflict? How do I deal with those kinds of disputes? And yeah, they've dealt with those in the past, but maybe not to this degree, and maybe not so much about those things that are fundamental.
Yeah. So, what are some examples of some of these, as you said, colliding values that may be prevalent in the workplace?
One of the benefits of social media is that people have been able to air their opinions. They can talk about what they like in public places, but it means that some of the things that we share, others might find uncomfortable or even offensive. What we do is we see things on there that jar with other people, and they jar because because of it's jarring with their core beliefs, it's their fundamentals.
Right.
These are the principles on which we build our lives, the principles that guide our decisions and behaviors, because they're based on our lived experience. All the things that we learned growing up, all the things that we learned through every experience that we've had sort of guide those principles and beliefs. So, for example, where we're seeing, as you pointed out earlier, more polarized politics all over the world,
Right.
people are expressing their views, their opinions publicly, and these conversations spill into the workplace, right? And of course, because they're not just opinions about policy, and we're talking about people's position over things like human rights, these are striking at people's core values. And because they're fundamentals, they're visceral conversations that people are having, and so people are getting upset by them. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not blaming social media,
Right.
or even it's just politics. I think that societally we've become much more aware of the experiences of people. You know, if you think like Me Too and the awareness that's created of the experiences that women had in the workplace, and you sort of think back to the death of George Floyd and the way that Black Lives Matters and campaigns and movements like that have really helped us be aware of what is going on in the world, the experiences that people have, and then awareness, greater awareness around things like human trafficking, sexual exploitation, the difference in LGBTQ rights across the world in different locations. And all of these have enlightened us about the experiences of people in society and, of course, in the workplace. And people have opinions on everything, and they air them in social media, they discuss them in the workplace. But what may be an opinion aired in the apparent safety of social media, we kind of think it's okay to post something here or there, that can strike at people's fundamental beliefs and core values. So it is really visceral, as I mentioned, and it creates those points of collision because we're talking about stuff that we don't normally talk about or we haven't talked about in the past.
Yeah, and today we're talking about this collision of your personal values, your professional responsibilities. So, what is your perspective on this? Can this also, let's say, be a disagreement with company policy to have this much of your authentic self out there in the social media?
Absolutely right, it can. We're seeing disagreements on three levels. I think we're seeing that disagreement between people, as we've been talking about, where you get those opinions spilling into collisions of values in the workplace. And we're also seeing collisions that can happen on an organizational to individual level. So, for example, we're seeing the difference between the values that people have and hold themselves and the values of an organization, where we should remember that, you know, the values of an organization drive the behaviors in that organization. They will drive the decisions that are made by people within the organization. So it's not surprising that sometimes you get a collision. So we're seeing more people decide whether or not they want to work with a business based upon their ethical values, based upon the businesses and the way they operate. More people are expecting businesses to be ethical, the organizations that they work with, the partners in the supply chain to be more sustainable, their ethics, how they treat people, all of those kind of things. And you know, I saw some surprising stats from Generation Alpha where they're saying that amongst those groups, we're seeing almost as much as 20% of people making decisions based upon ethics, and many higher percentages of people saying, I'm not going to use that product, or I'm going to dump that organization, or I'm going to, you know, we've seen this all over the press,
Right.
or I'm not going to work for that. So we're choosing whether or not we're working for organizations. It also means that where you already work for an organization and you see a change in policy, or you see behaviors from leaders within that organization that fundamentally jar with our values, there's going to be a collision between the values of the individual and the values of the organization. And we're seeing, particularly in the States, where at the moment, a consequence of the executive orders, political decisions, we're seeing people that are in fear of their jobs because they're afraid they're going to be seen as a diversity hire. You know, I've got a very good friend that lives in the United States and said to me, you know, I am worried about my job. This is a white gay man that is genuinely concerned. He works for a public servant. We've also seen in other parts of the world where people are feeling challenged and at risk because of their identity or their disability or a consequence of the way that they're being treated at work. So all of this has an impact and can create those collisions between the organization and the individual. I mentioned three areas. So we talked about people to people, we talked about people to organizations. The other one is actually within global organizations themselves, and this is sometimes surprises people. But quite a long time ago, I can remember a company coming to me and saying, hey, look, we've got a bit of a problem because we're a global organization. We've got a policy about inclusion. How do we deal with that policy in the Middle East, where we've got challenges over sexual identity and LGBTQ plus, or in other parts of the world where we've got challenges around disability or other identities and so on. And so it's recognizing that these two policies, the need for an organization to have a sort of global desire to create that inclusive environment where people can thrive, where they can be their best, is clashing with, or colliding, if you like, locally, where there are legal restraints and restrictions that sort of counter or contradict the fundamental beliefs of the global organization. So it means that organizations are having to look at how they work in those local regions, but still maintain those core values across the organization, things around creating those environments, collaboration, and so on. And it's the same with things like ethics, trafficking, sustainability, and so on. So they're having to ask those questions about inclusion as much as things like sustainability. And again, it's that clash in values.
Well, let's talk specifics here. So, what do you do when a disagreement comes up at work that gets at a core value of yours? How do you suggest people engage or not engage? What's your perspective, Jeremy?
I think that, we've thought about this a lot, especially when we were putting together this, how do we deal with this situation where values collide? And I think one of the things that we need to bear in mind is that with globalization, we've seen more and more diverse teams. So disputes between people are inevitable. Having that sort of harmonious team where there's a sense of belonging, people come together, it's not something that just happens, not by accident. And we need to work hard at it. A very good friend of mine said, creating an inclusive workplace isn't about being nice to each other and sitting around a campfire with a guitar and singing songs. It's actually about learning to disagree well. And I think it's a comment that sat well with me because it is about learning to disagree, learning to understand somebody else's perspective. It's recognizing that conflict's going to exist, that people are going to have different opinions, recognizing disputes. It's recognizing those collisions of values and fundamentals, but it's having conversations about them. And that can take a lot of hard work and effort, mostly because it's uncomfortable, but we shouldn't avoid it.
Absolutely. I just want to underline it. That is such a huge statement. Learning how to disagree well.
Absolutely. The other thing that I think about is a namesake of yours, Dr. Michael Svigel. I think that's how it's pronounced. He's into systematic theology. He's based out of Dallas. He said, avoiding disagreement can often rob people of the opportunity for growth and grace. As I unpack that, I think there's something about actually, if we don't have the conversation, we're not giving somebody a chance to understand their perspective, the difference between their perspective of others, and the impact and the consequence of their beliefs. Because I think sometimes we push stuff under the carpet and we push it to one side. We deny them that opportunity. And the frustrations of not being able to air your opinion or give your ideas is one thing, but actually not being able to unpack it and understand what that opinion means and how it affects others because of its difference from other people is really important. But I think, Michael, there's another really important thing to bear in mind here when we're thinking about how we learn to disagree well. And that's the consequences of doing nothing much greater in many ways, because these things have a tendency to escalate. They can turn into something nasty. The consequences can be serious in terms of individual harm. They can impact in terms of personal and organizational reputation. In terms of what we do about it, it really is about engaging in conversation. But as I've said it, there's a word that sort of strikes me in that. We talk about engage, and we often have this phrase, we should engage in conversation. There's always something about the word engage that suggests to me that we should approach it a bit like a battle. And I think sort of engage in conflict. And I think that's the mistake some of us make, is that we kind of go at this as though it's a battle that needs to be won and somebody needs to be right. And actually, the approach to this that we need to take is one about thinking about what our mindset is as we go into this. And that's one of the pillars that we got in terms of our 7 pillars of disagreeing well. And that dates back to the times of Roman fora, and actually before that to Greek philosophy. It sounds a bit grand, doesn't it?
It does.
But it's fundamentally what we're saying here is we need to approach others' opinions with curiosity and interest. We need to understand their perspective. People like Aristotle, when you think back to some of the things that people like Aristotle have said, they talk about, we can't possibly enter a debate until we fully understand their perspective and their side of the argument. And actually quite powerful, if you think about it, if you can put yourself in the shoes of the other debater, and, when you look at rules about debating that have gone back, and you think of people in places like halcyon establishments like Eton, where they have these debating societies that have existed for years, and they have done all over the world. And it's a big thing in the States, right? A lot of the power of that debate is actually being able to understand and almost outthink, like a chess player, what the perspective is of the other person. So understanding the other person's perspective is actually key to being able to get these conversations. However, we need to do that with humility. And the key to disagreeing well is asking lots of questions. It's listening really effectively and then asking more questions.
Well, I can see how that is. I don't know if you'd say easier said than done. It's almost like one of those things where people say it's simple, but it's not easy. So
Yeah.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on how leaders can manage this dynamic.
I think it's as much down to thinking about these principles and what we can apply. I mean, and probably our newest program, When Values Collide, is all about disagreeing well. And it's a phrase, that I've used as in our conversation just now. It's about bringing people into discussions and having conversations with them. When we started to put together When Values Collide, we realized we need to start with looking at personal values, looking at organizational values and how they drive behaviors and decisions, and then move on to looking at how the values of organizations drive the behaviors within organizations, and also how there can be collisions, where those collisions come from, those collisions on 3 levels. And that's something that we look at and started to unpack within that program. And also look at the principles that I've mentioned about disagreeing well. Now, these 7 principles we've actually drawn from a whole body of knowledge, and that's based on things like well-established research, practices in the field from experts in things like negotiation, conflict management, values-based discussions, as well as things like debating and techniques and coaching. And that's not to mention the Greek philosophers and the debating Romans that we were mentioning earlier. So if you can imagine 7 pillars around a Roman forum, that classic picture of
Sure.
the Roman baths in southwest England. And you've got these pillars around this central place and maybe a stone bench or something like that. And perhaps draped upon those pillars, there are some principles. And what we're saying is we're choosing to step into that metaphoric forum. We're choosing to disagree well, to have a discussion, to see conflicts from, as different perspectives and almost opportunities rather than those battles to win. We're drawing on each of these 7 pillars to support the conversation, almost as though the 7 pillars are supporting the conversation, a bit like they support the roof of the forum. So we
Hmm.
want to draw on each of them. We can't have one without the others. We need to think about utilizing all six of them. So we need to demonstrate humility and ask lots of questions, listen effectively and ask more. We need to go into the conversation based upon a mindset of disagreeing well, a mindset of trying to find out and understand, a mindset that isn't about it's a battle. There's a good reason for that. I think most of these conversations, it's fair to say, Michael, isn't it, that it's going to be emotionally charged.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
People have got fundamental values and anything like this. And I think often that's what puts us off having the conversations, because we know there's going to be an emotional reaction. So actually, going back to what you're saying about how do managers do this, the way we go into it is to make sure that we're using curiosity and we're asking those questions. The reason that we do that, if you think about it from what the brain does, the natural response is to be defensive, to stand our ground, to feel that our opinion has got to outweigh the other person's. Well, we've all done it. We've all been in those conversations, and it's absolutely natural. But what the brain does when we're accused of something, we go into our most natural fight or flight mode. And what it's useful to recognize is that when we go into that fight or flight mode, the brain shuts down access to certain parts of memory. Think about it. If you're going to run away from a saber-toothed tiger or punch it on the nose, you don't need to access your past history and memory and all of that. You just need your body to be ready to do one or the other. So the brain actually, even today, way past saber-toothed tigers, we actually shut down parts of access to certain parts of memory. And we tend to rely on our limbic system, which is the emotional center of the brain. So that's where you get this emotional charged response. Now, a really simple technique is to ask a question of somebody. And when you make people think, you're getting them to pause and engage the conscious thought process rather than more of the unconscious thought process. And that means that we're much more likely to engage the conscious and go into that rational thinking mode. It's a really simple technique, but actually the asking of those questions means that people have just got to take a pause and answer the question. So in conflict situations, sometimes what we do when somebody's been accused of something, they go, I didn't mean to do that, I didn't mean to do that, and you get that emotional response where you're just simply saying to them, okay, so what do you think the consequence of that was? How do you think that person was affected? And that just engages that conscious thought. So we're moving from the emotional to the more rational, and it actually takes the heat out of it. So the whole thing here is using simple techniques, things as simple as questioning, to get over one of the things. And a reminder of one of these things is one of the pillars, which is that emotions can hamper a good discussion. So to disagree well, we're really trying to move from that emotional conversation to something which is more logical, and that allows the brain to access that vast database of knowledge rather than just restricting to the fight or flight emotional stuff. And those discussions mean we can start to develop more understanding, and one that is much more likely to move the conversation into establishing things like common ground where we align. And that's another pillar. It's about getting to the common ground because we want to understand where we overlap. Have you got time for me to give you a quick story?
Absolutely. This is a podcast forum.
I had a very good friend working for a massive retailer in the United States. He was a black African American guy, big into his church music. He was gay, and he was transferred from the area of the States where he grew up to a different part of the United States. And he was quite senior. And in his new team, there was a member of the team that refused to speak to him. And we'll call this guy John for the sake of argument.
Okay.
I don't know, the guy that refused to speak to him, let's call them Tim. John spoke to one of his colleagues and he said, look, obviously I'm getting to know the team, but I really can't get in touch with this guy. He's refusing to speak to me. And John's colleague said, it's because you're gay. Tim's deeply religious and fundamentally doesn't believe in same-sex relationships. And so John went to see Tim and he had a chat with him. He said, hey, I understand that you're into your church music. And they started chatting. They discovered that not only were they both deeply religious, they were both into their church music. They both led the music in the churches.
Oh, wow.
And so they established this common ground. And as a consequence of that, they were able to decide what was important to their capacity to work together. So which of these values fundamentally were blocking their capacity to work together and to what degree. And actually, they were then able to agree that their sexuality or the sexual identity or their beliefs about that shouldn't get in the way of their capacity to actually work together as individuals. Doesn't need to get in the way. And that was a long conversation. I'm truncating it. But that's another pillar. It's thinking about what's important in this conversation, how important that is to what we need to achieve. So it's distinguishing between the values that are key and distinguishing between those that are more important and those that are less important to what we are trying to achieve here, usually working together. It's about leaders being realistic in these conversations. And so often it's not just whether or not they're going to be able to have the conversation and whether or not it can be achieved, because we can get over that. We can reduce the temperature in the conversation and we can shift it from that more emotional to the more rational discussion. But the mindset that we have, the approach that we have to that is key. And it's thinking about making sure that we have the conversation from an openness, making sure that we're not thinking of that battle to win, but actually looking at what we can achieve, what is going to be possible. And, we're not going to cure people in these conversations. What's the American phrase? We're not going to boil the ocean.
Yes, exactly.
We're not going to do everything. However, I think we can make a difference. We can ask conversations. We can be curious. We can demonstrate some empathy. We can explore common ground. We can work out what's important in the conversation. And we can make a difference to our own understanding, probably first, and also probably to their understanding. And we can do that through decent debate and discussion in order to be able to disagree well.
Jeremy, this has been an amazing conversation. I personally look forward to investigating more about the upcoming GP Strategies workshop, When Values Collide. And on behalf of our many listeners, I want to thank you for sharing your insight today. It's been a pleasure. The Performance Matters podcast is brought to you by GP Strategies. Together, we can create a world where business excellence makes possibilities achievable. You can subscribe to the show anywhere you get podcasts or listen on our website at gpstrategies.com.